Hello, Crosspoint family. Um, Here again with you for the Deep Root series. This is week 16. I just want to commend the other brothers for doing a great job, and I think the content has been wonderful. Here in week 16, we are starting, the title is What is Sin? And we are starting a new section in Sin Defined. And these are the next several weeks. Sin Defined, and then Origin of Sin, I am a sinner for 2 weeks, and then Consequences of my sin. So this video is actually going to be just a brief overview of what is sin. The scripture that is associated with this week of week 16 is 1 John 3:4. Everyone who makes a practice of sinning also practices lawlessness. Sin is lawlessness. And oftentimes, outside the Christian faith, there doesn't seem to be much talk about sin. You don't hear, um, the local news reporters or anyone really talking about sin in that regard. And in 1973, a long time ago, it feels like, Carl Menninger wrote a book entitled Whatever Became of Sin. And he says this: the very word sin, which seems to have disappeared, was once a proud word. It was once a strong word, an ominous and serious word. But the word went away. It has almost disappeared, the word along with the notion. Why? Doesn't anyone sin anymore? Doesn't anyone believe in sin? And it does seem that outside the Christian faith, it doesn't seem that there's many that believe in sin. That sin is either pushed away and just looked at or regarded as a societal structure, or it's deflected only towards those who are making flagrant sins. And this issue has come up in years past also. Two Christian gentlemen, both famous, have seen the effects that people that are not Christians look at the way they look at sin. And C.S. Lewis said this: the barriers I have met is that the almost total absence from the mind of my audience of any sense of sin. And of course, a more recent quote by D.A. Carson on the frustrating aspect of doing evangelism in universities. He says this: they know how to sin well enough, but they have no idea of what constitutes sin. Well, we find that the Westminster Shorter Catechism speaks of sin defined as any want of conformity to the law of God or transgression of the law. Sin is disobeying or not conforming to God's law in any way, in a more modern way of the Shorter Catechism there. So what is sin? David uses several words in Psalm 51 to describe sin. And of course, in 1 John 3:4, we have lawlessness. And sin is to miss the mark, as if you were shooting an arrow at a bullseye target. Anything that's not in that target would be considered missing the mark, would be considered sin. Iniquity is to bend or to twist, and to transgress is to go aside or go beyond. And we'll talk about these in a few moments, but all of these would be in relation to God's law. So to sin would be to disregard God's law, missing the mark, iniquity, and transgression. Jerry Bridges in Respectable Sin said this about the 1 John 3:4. The Apostle John wrote, sin is lawlessness. All sin, even sin that seems so minor in our eyes, is lawlessness. It is not just the breaking of a single command. It is a complete disregard for the law of God, a deliberate rejection of his moral will in favor of fulfilling one's own desire. In Craig Troxell's book, With All Your Heart, Orienting Your Mind, Your Desire, and Your Will Towards Christ, he looks at the inwardness of sin and what it has done, and that the mind, what you know, well, sin is to fall short of what you know. In your desire, what you love, we should love Christ. Well, we twist those desires for other things. So that's iniquity, to twist or pervert. And in the will, what we choose, we should choose to love God and do right things, but instead we transgress and rebel. So another way of saying what sin is sin is a rejection of God's authority. and the exaltation of the autonomy of the self. There is really no other passage of scripture that I can think of that so defines um, that definition like Judges 21:25. If you remember the passage of scripture, it is where Israel has no king and there is no judge. There is no regard for the law, and as the scripture says, everyone did as they saw fit. And that's really what sin is. It is doing what you want to do versus what the law of God would have us do. Another definition is by Thomas Watson in his book A Body of Divinity. Sin is a violation or transgression. A moral law is to keep us within the bounds of duty. Sin is going beyond our bounds. Again, that's the thought of transgression there, the thought of iniquity. We're going beyond the bounds of what God's law has given us. So why we shouldn't sin is the second question in this week. And it says that anytime a person sins, he or she acts in a way that is not like Jesus. That's a kind of a simple definition of why we shouldn't sin. As we look further, Thomas Watson gave us several other passages, not passage, but points of why we shouldn't sin. And these I think are excellent ways. So why we shouldn't sin. Sin is evil in the nature of it. It is a defiling thing. Watson goes on to say, it makes the soul red with guilt and black with filth. Sin is a grieving God's spirit there in Ephesians 4:30. Sin is a disease affecting the whole man, the body, the mind, and the spirit. And then we have sin as an irrational thing. Again, Watson says sin is an irrational thing and makes a man act not only wickedly but foolishly. It is absurd and irrational to prefer the lesser before the greater, the pleasures of life before the rivers of pleasure at God's right hand forevermore. We also see, and although those are terrible things, here is even more things why we shouldn't sin. Sin is a painful thing. Sin produces all temporal evil. And finally, and most importantly, sin, unrepented of, brings final damnation. But I've talked a lot about bad news, but I want to give you the last passage of Scripture following the 1 John passage 3:4, and that is 1 John 3:5. You know that he appeared in order to take away sins, and in him there is no sins. Well, thank you for joining me, and we look forward to your participation in the next few weeks and finding out more about sin. And then finally, after that, after the few weeks of sin, we will talk about Jesus Christ. Thank you.